Welcome back, everyone, to the MedTech Easy podcast. It's great to have you all back with another episode. So today we're here with a very special guest, quite renowned in the MedTech world, been on a number of podcasts. He's the clinical um, excellence lead at Innovest Medical. He's also orthopedic surgeon by background. He's also a researcher and educator at Imperial College London. Again, he's a keen user of technology, quite fitting with our podcast, an innovator and a policy developer in the UK and the US. He's also an advisor to health tech startups and a mentor at Byte Labs. So it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast today. And I'm sure as someone with many talents and diverse career paths, there's a lot our listeners can look forward to today.
You guys are too kind. That was a very nice intro. Thank you so much. Pleasure to meet you guys. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate that. I guess let's get down to it. What questions have you got for me?
Right. So, first question. So, from being a med student like us, because that's the stage we're at right now, and that's the stage where most of our viewers are at, going from where we are to where you've basically come so far, can you tell us a bit about your journey briefly?
Yeah, sure. I'll try and summarize it. I mean, my route has always been quite convoluted from the beginning, really. I started with a degree called biomedical sciences. You probably have heard of it. So
Yeah.
I actually got into medicine in multiple places, but I just didn't quite make the cut when it came to my A levels. Unfortunately, I took too much on during that time. It's my own fault. And I guess that's my first bit of advice to you is to try and get through the core requirements of your next stage without taking too many things on. So as one of my close colleagues would say, Elliot, it'd say focus is key. And I think when you're at that young stage, it's quite easy to kind of get distracted and do lots of fun things, as well as do extra subjects, which is the crux of what happened to me. I was doing five of those A levels. And so I ended up doing biomedical science, which was actually something I would never go and turn back on. It was one of the best experiences I've had. I learned a massive amount about basic sciences, academia, and lab work. I met some incredible people along the way. I actually paused that degree for a year to be a sabbatical role within the Students' Union at my medical school, which was St. George's. So I was the president for a year. And I mean, that was like not only seriously quite intense. We're running a business that was turning over, I think, about 1.5 million that year. But also I was managing a team. A lot of that team were volunteers who were elected like officials, representatives for various elements of the student life. I was also in a very privileged position to sit on the perfect cross section of every meeting and system within the medical school, all the way from curriculum decisions, exam decisions, all the way up to space and estates and facilities and future planning decisions, sitting on the council. I remember at the time the medical school was trying to merge with another university, and I was heavily involved with that process as well, which was in itself just a lot. For at the time I was 19 turning 20, a lot for me to handle as essentially a teenager. And then finishing that, I moved into medicine at the same place. I got into the graduate program. So then I was in a completely different cohort of people. Suddenly the average age of my cohort, I think at the time, was 37. And I was one of the youngest ones, already been at the university for basically 4 years. And at that time, I was also working part-time at Imperial College, doing academic work and a little bit of design work for the various academic outputs they did that was related to public health and training in the WHO. So I was like juggling lots of things already by that point, and graduated, got into foundation program. I was actually in Basingstoke for my foundation program, so the Wessex Deanery. That was really good fun. It was like a microcosm on its own out there. And during that time, I basically focused on doing the USMLE exams. I was really like dead set on moving to the States. I'd done a number of clerkships, observerships, sub-Is out there as well in Johns Hopkins, in California, and in North Carolina. And I was like, wow, medicine and healthcare and surgery out there is just on another level. 5 a.m. board rounds and then 6 a.m. ward rounds and then, you know, book club at
Yeah.
9, 10 p.m. And it's just wild. But what I loved out there was just the innovation. Everyone was like, was pushed to be quite innovative. But I was dead set on being surgeon. At that point, you know, the innovation side of the thing, side of things inside me was still quite suppressed, you know, and it was mainly a hobby that I'd used to go and do. There was lots of little side hustles related to innovation throughout my career that I won't go and dive into at the moment. But the idea was that I was still dead set on surgery, and I was really until, you know, doing my SMLEs, and then you know, I was doing like an academic fellowship as well at Basingstoke. Which was a junior academic knee fellow role, and you know, I had basically a life-changing event, which meant that I had to kind of refocus a little bit, think, well, what was important to me at the time, and that was family, that was my surroundings, my friends, and jumping on a plane to America and being alone in that environment is probably actually suddenly the least most appealing thing to me. So I actually took a step back and looked at my core values and thought, what was really important to me? And surgery was still really crucial to me. Education was crucial to me. Academia was crucial to me. And I could fulfill all those things here. So I carried on. I did core training. And I dived into quite deeply about the process of getting into core training on another podcast. And that was quite interesting in itself. And then, you know, tackling my way through core training towards the end of it, just before applying to ST, or around that time, COVID hit. And then and I you know, I was redeployed for like 10 months into ITU, where we were given, like, you know, a couple of bin bags and 2 masks per 13-hour shift, in a PACU that was converted, and told, you know, good luck, basically. You know, ventilating colleagues that were collapsing, you know, huge numbers of like really bad outcomes, because we were sharing CVVHD machines and respirators, splitting respirators and things like that. And I was burnt out by the end of that. I'm going to be honest with you, whilst taking exams and MRCS stuff. And I remember talking to my TPD at the time, Stella Vig. You may recognize that name. And she was like someone that saved my life, to be honest. You know, she grounded me and helped me get through it all. And it was around that time I was like, well, look, I was trying to take stock of what I was really interested in doing, and I had ignored this one core value of mine, which was innovation. And throughout my life, even from a young age, I was basically just taking apart things and fixing them or repairing them or trying to find out ways of improving them. And I realized I did that every time there was a quality improvement project or perhaps it was an audit or something like that, and I'd turn it into, oh, how are we going to improve the ward, or how are we going to improve our functioning? And there's so many times I'd get in trouble because I'd go and, you know, do a little improvement, whether it be software related or not, and then I get in trouble because I just went ahead and did it. I did get in trouble for one in Basingstoke, where I basically automated this whole like blood reporting process. And it was just because it was a resistance to change. It wasn't like I was violating any data guidelines or anything like that. So I realized that was a value of mine that I had been ignoring. And actually the spark came from some of these like pre-courses on the clinical entrepreneurship program that opened my eyes a little bit. And plus, even before that, I was like, wow, what is really bugging me in my core training as an SHO running around doing errands? And one of the things that really like ticked me off, especially in a paper-based hospital, was consent forms. And I was like, man, I need to try and figure this out. And I realized that it had already been like done to death by so many other people and entities. I was like, well, I can't go and do that, because there's a book called Blue Ocean Thinking, which I really like. And it's actually, well, why am I entering that red ocean full of competition? I've got to go think about something else. So, and whilst I was pondering, and certainly lots of things came to my mind, there's lots of things that are still parked in my mind, some things that I am doing with different people. But during that process, actually, I came across this job at Innovus and decided to apply for it, and I got it. And I absolutely, I do love this job, and you know, there's been elements of it that have really opened up not only my eyes to the world of innovation, especially in surgery, but also it's been an interesting experience working in a startup that's now scaling up to have really learned so much about so many different aspects of a business like this. So I really learned so much throughout that process. And I guess here I am now, like, looking back on it all, being like, well, I never really was on a traditional path. And I always was trying to do different things at pretty much every stage of my career, all the way back to school. So I don't think I was ever going to be on a traditional path. And one thing that I've definitely learned from a lot of my mentors is that no two paths are the same when you start to foray out of that tunnel that is the medical training pathway. You can look at people who you'd want to aspire to be like when you're older and when you grow up. But one thing's for certain is that that path is going to be very unique for you. There may be elements of that path that might have been well trodden before, and you can try and like mimic elements of it, but it's a very unique and very like a special process to you. And I think that's the most important thing to take away from this, is that like no matter what story you hear, don't expect to go out and copy paste it word for word or step for step, because it's unique to you. And that's the most important thing. Everyone is literally unique in this world. And I know that sounds cheesy, but this is especially important when you think about alternative career paths, regardless of the industry that you're coming from or going into.
I think that's really inspirational. So looking back at it, now that you've sort of reflected on how you were even pre-medical school and through medical school, and thereafter just looking for change, looking for improvement. And one thing you mentioned that really caught my attention was resistance to change. And I think that's one of the biggest not problems, but the biggest
Challenges.
characteristics that yeah, talents that the medical system well has, unfortunately. But as much as it changes, it also doesn't. So you've actually answered the next few questions that we had for you, which was why you how you ended up in this, but I think you touched upon that quite clearly. So did you always sort of know you were gonna start off in a non-surgical route because you were quite set on it? Or was it that one event that sort of made you realize that, okay, I need to like take all my passion for change, for innovation, and then that made you apply for this role at Innoverse and completely give up, all the clinical work that you've been doing? Well, not completely, because you're still involved in clinical excellence, but directly treating patients is what I mean.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Look, it's a good question. I don't think there was one pivotal moment, apart from I could probably pin a lot on that burnout phase, post-COVID, post-exams. That period of time for me was like, there were a couple of things that hit me at that time, which one was that, okay, I was burnt out and I took a bit of time off, and I'm thinking, well, I'm not going to get paid like fully for this time off, and eventually I won't get paid at all if I'm not working. So that's the first thing that came to mind. It's like existential about, well, if I'm not literally physically there and operating, not getting paid. And this resonated with me and reminded me of some of the conversations that I had with other mentors that were very, very senior surgeons at the end of their careers, that where they're like, their bodies were failing them because of the years of bad ergonomics whilst operating, right? And they're suddenly now find themselves in a position where they can't now provide for their family that often. They're operating only a couple of days a week because it's quite tiring on the body. And so a lot of them shift into doing like outpatient work or doing stuff like insurance companies, whatever, which still keeps things ticking over, but it's not like what it was before, and it's not quite as secure, obviously. And obviously there was that element of, well, yes, I loved what I did, but I was stuck in this kind of, there was bottlenecks in training, stuck in this role that was like this perpetual SHO or acting registrar role, where it was like, just felt like I was doing the same thing day in, day out. And it was really mentally and physically exhausting. I will be honest with you. I have a lot of time for consultant surgeons because they've gone through the full training. And knowing that these guys have really powered through what is some of the hardest years, for not just for themselves, but for their families, and for the sacrifices they've had to make throughout that process, not only for them, you know, their exams and their mental and physical health, but for everyone around them. That's really hard. And I think having what had happened to me in such a short space of time made me realize that I mean, I probably could have been very resilient and just cracked on. And I did, to be fair, but I just did it as less than full time. And I found another role in health tech, also less than full time. Ironically, I was doing 60 and 60. So I was like conjuring up 120% out of nowhere. I don't know where that came from. But the point is that I was doing something that was now giving me a lot of motivation in my surgical role. And I still do locum shifts where I can, but the idea is that you know, it is a completely like optional thing for me. Obviously it's mandatory for my progression in terms of my maintaining a license to practice, but it's not like my mandatory form of income, and it's not my mandatory work. So for me, it was more about future-proofing my work, future-proofing myself as well, and also doing something that I really love doing, which was something that was really quite missing as a trainee, ironically, was training. You know, there were the moments that I will never forget, which is when, you know, I had an F1 or F2 by my side, or medical student, and I'd be like, right, come down to A&E with me. There's this lady that's felt fallen over and basically degloved her knee. Let's go and sew it up, right? And I'll teach them how to suture. I'll teach them how to do a washout, teach them how to do a joint injection or a joint aspiration, or even like a DHS and things like that. I love doing that. I love the teaching element. And there just wasn't much in terms of simulation and training around me as well. And also the academic opportunities were like few and far between. You really had to like come in on days off to get stuff done like that, and really schmooze and work with the right consultants. And there's an element of being in the right place at the right time. It wasn't like part of the process. And that was one thing, I've got to be honest with you, when I was in the States, I did notice that, like, not only is the training so rigid, so you know, it's Johns Hopkins, they literally had 2 days a week. I think one was on sawbones for like an entire day, and then the other day was literally in cadaveric training and simulation training. And that was like a fixed amount of training that the initial residents had. And then they also had academic requirements. They had to publish certain things every year or every rotation. And I absolutely loved the way that was just integrated within their career paths. And for us, it was like, well, you know, it's not mandatory, but when it comes to your application stage, you know, when you're at the next bottleneck, it's like, well, if you haven't done those things, you're at disadvantage. But then you're like, at what point do they give me time to think about doing those things? It just felt so disjointed and so difficult. I know plenty of people that are trying to like change the training continuum so that there is like integrated training, innovation training pathways or academic pathways, a bit like the AFP and stuff like that. There's a lot of change that I think we need to do within surgical and medical training to foster what is already a very leadership and academic focused thing, but also to foster that innovation within everyone. And we can't just rely on the likes of, you know, private entities like Byte Labs or Flux to train people. We can't rely on like NHS innovation-led projects like clinical entrepreneurship program as well. It needs to be integrated within, you know, even I would say from medical school. I was at the American College of Surgeons and Engineers conference in Chicago recently, and they had a presentation from, I think it was the University of Sharjah in the UAE, where they basically had, I'm pretty sure it's that university, I'll double check, but they basically had a presentation on basically the medical students were trained in innovation design weeks. And I think they used the Google model. And they'd go away and they'd go into the hospital and figure out what were the problems in the hospital that they could go and innovate and change. And one particular team, I think, came up with this really cool gown idea, like hospital gown that you could use one-handed for people that were basically in a sling, having shoulder surgery and elbow surgery. Like, the problem with the gown is if you had upper limb surgery, you basically can't use them properly. And they wanted to give a little bit of dignity as well to those that wanted a little bit more of their skin covered up. Because a lot of the time with a normal gown, it's like you just see the slither of the back, you know, you see the patient's back and bum basically. And so that didn't give them dignity, and they weren't able to tie it properly because it's one-handed. And so that was just an example that ended up being basically a product. They haven't commercialized any of the things out of that university, but what they came up with was like 20 or 30 different products that was just from medical school, from medical students that were gaining information on their placements and coming back and applying that information to innovation design weeks. And that was integrated within the medical school. And I just was so inspired with that idea that it's like, why don't we have that? Why don't we have that in our medical schools here? I don't know why. And I'd love to change that. I'd love to be part of that change. But, you know, the fact that you guys are even pursuing that, yeah, it's not just you guys as well. There's so many other medical students I've met along my career that are so passionate about innovation that I really feel that it shouldn't be something that you guys are having to strive for as extracurricular stuff. It really should be integrated. I really truly believe that. Probably ranting now, but I hope you get what I mean.
No, it's not a rant. We completely kind of agree. You know, it is something which definitely needs to change. And like kind of like going at it from what you said, like the grassroots, which is, you know, the medical school, medical students, educating, you know, those people coming through the system. That's probably a more kind of a better way of dealing, like trying to drive that change, rather than kind of becoming more set in your ways. You could say once you start working in the NHS and kind of like bureaucratic things and kind of systems you get kind of stuck into, it's hard to kind of like drive that innovation from that, or have the time to really think about it, in that sense. I don't know whether you've kind of found parallels and stuff, you know, in the surgical world. And like you said, kind of like having to think on your own about stuff about consent and like how is a way I could change this or innovate this to make it more like a streamlined process. That's something which people don't really have the time and then just to do at the moment. So definitely agree on that point.
Good point. The lack of time is so. I would say you have time at medical school unless you're revising for exams. But I remember when I was trying to build this like basically clickable prototype or MVP, whatever you want to call it, of this consent platform. I was working on this Excel spreadsheet full of macros at like 2 a.m. whilst on call, you know, whilst waiting for the bleep to go off, basically in the room. I was just sitting there like tapping away, the bleep would go off, or like have to pause everything. Then I'd go and, you know, see this patient, clerk the patient, bring them in, make sure they're fine and dandy, make sure everything's calm on the wards, go back upstairs. I'm like, right, let me have a look at the spreadsheet again. I was actually finding any time in it, like literally when I'm not asleep or when I'm not working, to try and work on this kind of stuff. And actually when I was doing both the Innovus and NHS like full-time basically, or part-time, but full-time collectively, I was, every minute of the day was packed basically. I would be constantly working, and that was tough. I'll be honest with you. The only reason why I managed to get through that, I will extend my thanks to the Epsom St. Helier rota coordinator team within trauma and orthopedics, who were amazing at letting me basically give them 6 months notice of all the stuff that I had to do for in the sector and the industry. And then I could work my rota around that. So that was amazing. But I know it's not the same for when you become a registrar. And I know it gets harder the more senior you get. You know, I know consultants that work as CEOs or CMOs or CTOs for massive companies, and they still juggle all of it. And I'm just so in awe by the fact that they're able to do that. You know, now that I'm basically full-time in the industry and I have multiple industry roles, I just genuinely don't know how I would able, you know, to go back into a full-time or even a part-time clinical role that has a rota and a structure. It'd be so tough for me now, because my time is already packed. Like I basically haven't left this desk all day for the last probably 13 hours. So it's been a long day. It's a very, very, very early start. So yeah, it is. I got to say, it's a different kind of work though. And I think on that point, you know, finding time can be easier if you're doing something or working on something that you're really passionate about. And if you have this ceaseless flow of inspiration that will just let you work on it and time passes, you know, that's really cool. But I think the most important thing for people that are still studying, or people that have got perhaps placements or exams or things that they need to do, that they mustn't let that side detract from the core progression that they have. You know, one of the most important things is that you don't fail an exam as a result of you trying to work on the innovation side, or working on your project, or working on a company. You know, that's the most important thing, is that you've got to, yes, find the time and balance it, but also make sure you prioritize the right things.
So my next question to you is about, so I'm just gonna streamline this more towards like direct questions for medics out there. So if you were to define MedTech for a third year medical student, what would it be?
Man, that's tough, because I think there is an agreed definition of what med tech is and what health tech is. And I believe that the difference lies in the software versus hardware element. I think the med tech is a little bit more of a hardware-based sets of solutions, whilst the health tech is a little bit more of a software-based solution. Please do not use me as a source of knowledge here. Like I'm not the dictionary on health tech, but the way that I would define it for a medical student, regardless whether it's health tech or med tech now, is we are trying to innovate for the benefit of our patients at the end of the day. Whether that's making things easier for the clinician, whether that's diagnosing things better and faster for the patient, whether that is allowing people to do things better, whether that's operating, whether that's scanning, whether that's moving patients around, you know, picking up on safety or efficiency discrepancies or deficiencies. I think the way that I could describe it without being too convoluted is to say that you're trying to innovate for the sake of patients. So immediately you're like, wow, that's a really big terminology. That's a really big definition, which could make you feel like you could have massive impact by doing something in medtech or health tech, way more impact than all the patients you may ever see in your entire career. And so immediately that's exciting. I hope that's exciting to people when they think about that definition.
I think, yeah, you've put it really well, and without being too streamlined, you've kind of generalized it, but at the same time explained what it is. Because this ties into my next question, which is, what do you think from your interactions with medical students so far? As you said, you know, lots of medics these days are trying to get involved, and the industry is bigger than ever. And so, what are the misconceptions associated with medical students wanting to get involved? Like, anecdotally, from my experience, before I got into it, all my friends in med school, because they know I run things like these, you know, we are involved in med tech per se. They ask me, oh, which coding language do you know? Or they go into the very technical sort of skill set, and they think that you have to be an engineer or a computer scientist to get involved. But what do you think the misconceptions are, and why do you think they're there?
This is a really good question, because a lot of people say that. A lot of people are like, oh, I can't get into that industry without going and taking a course on coding, or a course on product development, or a course on business management, or an MBA, or whatever it might be, right? They feel like they have to throw money at the problem first, you know?
Exactly. Yeah.
I think, and I say this a lot, and I probably ruffled a lot of feathers on this, but the hardest language to learn, I think, is the medical and surgical language. And you guys are learning, or if not, you've learned that already. So whatever these other languages may be, whether it's coding, which by the way has just been made 10 times easier with the advent of LLMs, right? Or if it's product development, or if it's business strategy, or whatever it might be. These are much easier languages for you to learn. So if you wanted to go and learn them, that's fantastic. And that would be great if you're going to be starting a company and you don't want to hire a CTO and you don't want to hire an engineer and all these things. That's fantastic. But the reality of it is, in the medtech space, if you look at all the unicorns in medtech, you look at like even Intuitive, the CEO of Intuitive is an engineer, Gary Guthardt. You know, if you look at the founding team of perhaps even CMR, you know, their competitor, ironically, I'm just talking about robotics companies now, but like Mark Slack, he's a practicing gynecology surgeon, right? So I think what I'm getting at here is that I don't know actually like Mark's entire career. I know him very well, but as in, I don't know his entire career. I don't know if he can code. I don't know if he can use a soldering iron or not. I'm sure he can, but I'm saying that he didn't need to. These people didn't need to. And what I'm getting at here is some of the best companies out there follow the economies of scale, and they follow specialization of labor. And these are some fundamental economics where basically we are saying that you are good at what you are doing and someone else is better at what they're doing. For you to be then juggling the clinical aspect, the engineering aspect, the coding, whether it's software or hardware development aspect, whether it's the product development aspect, whether it's now the commercialization and now acting as a salesperson, there is an element of you covering all those things to a certain degree, but you've got to remember why and who you are and what you've done and what you're best at doing. Your specialty is medicine and surgery. And so I would recommend to those that really want to make their idea successful is bring the right people on board early on, rather than going and spending God knows how much time and money learning something that you might not be the best at anyway, that you might need to bring someone in later down the line to solve that problem for you anyway. So that's my approach. I mean, there are obviously anomalies to this. I know plenty of like medical students and doctors that are just incredible at coding, and they can just, overnight in a hackathon create a solution to a problem, which is incredible. And these are, 1 in 1,000 now, perhaps, I don't know, 1 in a million, but these people are truly incredible. And I'm not saying if you are one of those people, I'm not saying drop your talents. You clearly have a talent. But if you're in that position where you don't know how to code and you don't know how to start a business, perhaps you could read about those things and understand them. But perhaps I would recommend bringing on people as part of your team to help you do those things that are experts in those fields or want to be experts in those fields, and that's what their strong points are. And just don't forget where your strong points are. And that also kind of brings me onto another topic, which is, what value can you bring to the industry? It's not all about starting your own business and coming up with your own idea. It's about also joining companies like I did with Innovus, right? And what can you bring to those companies? Well, you have to remember what stage you're at as well. And sometimes consider, as a medical student, it'd be very difficult to jump into a chief scientific officer role at a pharmaceutical company, for example.
Yeah.
So you have to think about, how can I now tailor my career to focus on getting a role like that? Do I want to be a CMO? Do I want to be a CSO? Do I want to be a CEO, perhaps? Now I've got to think about, what are my steps in my career that I need to make in order to make that more likely? And I don't know if coding comes up during that process. Do you see? So that's kind of my 2 cents on it. I mean, people will probably disagree with that, and I think that's the whole beauty of debate, is to let people disagree with that. But I genuinely believe that you should not stay in your lane. You should think about the other lanes, but you should definitely make the most of your lane and understand what your lane is fully before you move into any other.
Yeah, I think it's something which I've heard, people mention to me before, in terms of like, if you are a medical student or you're in the clinical space already, you should kind of try and obviously tap into that, because you have that knowledge base already. You have the familiarity with kind of the medical space. Maybe you shouldn't go straight into coding. But then I think if it's an interest for some people, which I would say, like, playing devil's advocate, if you kind of like find interest and pleasure and kind of building and doing those things as well, you should definitely try and, kind of strive for that and see if you can work a balance between them. But if you, for example, don't like anything to do with computers, you hate even something simple like Excel, but not many people don't really like Excel, um, then maybe, just like you said, there's definitely lots of roles, isn't there, in the medtech space. And there's kind of like, as you said, everyone's unique. So there is a space to show your talents and kind of tap into where you fit best, really. So I do agree on that point.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I'm glad that you brought that up, which is that perhaps, coding might end up being a real big passion of yours, and you won't know until you try it. You literally have to go around trying things and reading about things, but de-risk it for yourself. Keep it lean, which are business terminologies, but basically don't go and spend £2,000 on a coding course. Don't go and spend 150K on an MBA. Go and read about these things and try a little bit first and see if you're passionate about it before going a little bit deeper, for sure. Yeah, I agree with you. I think hopefully hopefully that's good advice to people out there that like probably look at themselves and think, oh man, I really want to do X, Y, and Z, but I have to go and do all these, learn all these new languages. And I hear this all the time. It's really, you're setting up a lot of pressure on yourself, basically. Don't want you to do that, because then you risk burning out and disappointing yourself,
Yeah.
But they are pull factors, and this is the key here. This is like these could be pull factors that change your career, and this is definitely something you shouldn't ignore.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I think just kind of like, let's say we want to kind of put it into frame for medical students or kind of our listeners. Um, we'll kind of do a bit of like a scenario. So let's say I'm I'm a third year medical student, which putting myself back a couple of years, but I find an issue on placement, and I'm kind of like heard of this MedTech, etc., but I'm not kind of sure about kind of what MedTech is in general. But I kind of write up like a quick, I guess, product design or kind of something how I would tackle this problem. I do a bit of like market research, which exists already, but I don't have any funding. I don't know any coding. I don't have any access to any parts, machines to build anything. I don't really know the difference between them. How could I practically kind of, what steps would you recommend I do to kind of like put those ideas into like maybe a MVP or kind of like a working product, or try and build those skills to kind of work in this space? What kind of advice would you give me?
This is a really good like scenario, because this is kind of what I was touching on earlier, which is that your placements or your clinical exposure, every single one should be an opportunity to think about a potential solution to a problem that you might see. And I'll be honest, in the NHS, there's plenty of problems for you to think about solutions to. So, I'm not trying to say that in a negative way. I'm trying to say that genuinely in a positive way. And what's really cool is that you could actually be overwhelmed. But what's cool about it is that you can pick on one that really you're really passionate about, that you keep seeing a lot. I think the first thing to do is to go and think about, what can I learn? So go and research. Exactly what you're doing is you're researching about the problem. How prevalent is this problem? How much does this problem cost? Not just in terms of money, but in terms of patients' lives, perhaps clinicians' time. Go and do a bit of like a market analysis and health economics analysis. Like, how big is this problem? If I was to then solve this problem, how big is the market associated with that problem? So what's the market size? Is it growing, that market? Like, what percentage is it growing by? The compound annual growth rate, the CAGR. If it's a big market and it's worth a lot of money, that's cool. I could get involved in that and have a slice of that pie. That's very cool. And then at that point, I'd go away and read. Maybe you read before that point. And there's so many books out there. There's a couple of books that I think I've mentioned one, which is Blue Ocean Strategy. There's one here called Built to Last by Jim Collins, which is a great book. I'm going to just keep scrolling through my list here until I find interesting ones. The Lean Startup. Now that's really important. I was going to come on to that anyway, which is building a lean canvas. I think you said in your question that you go away and write a product design and do market research. Well, the lean canvas kind of forces you to think in that way anyway. You think about who your customers are. You think about what the problem is, what the solution is, what's your unique value proposition. So what is it about your company that would attract your idea that would attract customers? And you go away and think about your unfair advantage. So what is it about your idea that's better than the rest of the market? What's the blue ocean thinking behind your idea? And then you go through certain things like what are the key metrics? What are the ins and outs of the business in terms of cost, the cost structure and the revenue structure? What is your avenue to the market? So how do you get to your customers? But the most important thing is you think about who your customers are first, and you've got to think about how many customers you can bring on board, because sometimes a MedTech or health tech solution might not just be for the patients, it might be for the clinicians, it might be for the managers or for the NHS management, or even higher up. You want to try and maximize the amount of revenue streams coming in. And then when you're at the revenue stage, do you just want a subscription model, or do you want people to think about, maybe a freemium model where they'll have to buy recurring things from you on a regular basis. If it's an actual physical product, is there a reusable or expendable part that needs replacing? Is there a subscription attached to a piece of software that runs the product as well? You know, these are all things that you need to think about as you build your idea. But before you go too deep, the most important thing is that you do your you know, I guess your lean canvas, your product design, you come up with your idea, and then you go and test it. And you're in the best position to test it because you're going back to that placement tomorrow after staying up all night writing all this. And you go back into the placement, you can ask questions to your customer segments. Well, my device was for clinicians, the nurses, and perhaps the consultants, you know, or something like that. So go and speak to those people. If it's for patients, go and speak to the patients. Be like, oh, by the way, I came up with this idea. What do you think of this? And don't just go, you know, like off the cuff. Like try and build a bit of structure to it, so that when you've got the data on the other side, you can actually analyze it and say, well, is this idea good or not? Should I persevere with it, or should I pivot or perish it? And the idea is that then you're making that decision based on evidence rather than it just be on gut. Which you shouldn't ignore your gut, but it's better to have some sort of evidence for you to think about what is the next step for this idea. And I think you touched on engineering knowledge and access to parts and machines, and that's tough. I will be honest with you. We don't, you know, there aren't many 3D printers knocking about in a hospital. Maybe if you're at a university, if you're at a bigger campus-based university, there might be an engineering department. You could go and ask, but then you've got to learn how to use the machine. You've got to get permission and all this. And you're a med student, you'll be like looked at funny, like, what are you doing here in this department? So this is where I think this is coming back to my earlier point, which is think about who you can bring on board with your idea. I've recommended to lots of very, very early stage student-based startups to go and put a little advert up in the engineering department of like not giving away too much, but just saying, we're looking for an engineer that loves doing X, Y, and Z and is passionate about health or something like that. And find those people early on, you know, co-found together. You'll be far more powerful and effective at actually solving your solution. And they might have access to the things that you don't have access to, which will hopefully help you solve your problem. And I guess that would be it. You know, just keep coming up with ideas. You know, I think that there will come a point where you may be a bit of a plant or a seed, and you come up with too many ideas. So you might need to bring someone else on that's like a bit of a monitor evaluator, or someone that will help you say, oh, well, these ideas are a bit too much, and this one's probably a bit more realistic, you know. So you might need someone to bounce ideas off that is also, you know, a medical student or clinician. So don't be afraid of like the teamwork in this process. A lot of people think that they should just take this all on board themselves, and they're worried that other people steal their ideas and perhaps dilute their share or whatever. But actually, firstly, NDAs are really useful. And secondly, you know, actually bringing the right people on board with your team early on will set you up for success. You know, the four main contributors to success when we analyze all the unicorns out there are not just the product, it's the team, it's the leadership of that team, and also it's the timing. Like Airbnb is the best example. For like years and years and years, it did badly until there was a housing crisis, and then suddenly the timing of it was perfect. So you got to think about all four of those things. And if you're a one-man band that's trying to do it all, you know, it's going to be really tough for you to succeed and become a health tech unicorn, which is what everyone wants to be in this industry. So that's my advice.
Yeah, thank you for that comprehensive answer to that question, because I think it's something that everyone thinks about, you know, like, oh, I've got this cool idea and I don't know how to pursue it, but hopefully this podcast will help give them some advice. Next question, I promise you it's a last scenario, but it's on networking. So
Oh yeah.
you are back in 30 at St. George's. Back then, you meet the clinical excellence lead of Innovus. Imagine there is one. And
Well, Innovus was around back then. I just wasn't.
Yeah, all right.
Been around for a bit, been around for 12 years. Elliot
wow,
and Jordan,
okay.
the co-founders, were like by themselves for a good 5-6 years. Bless them.
Oh wow.
Yeah, they did it. They did amazingly.
Right.
But
So
yeah,
you,
I get your point.
yeah. And everyone knows networking is important. You've added this clinical excellence lead on LinkedIn. you've had a chat with them. What else do you do? How do you really foster or make the best use of your network?
Yeah, great question. I think firstly, don't be afraid to message like you just signposted there. It's really, really important just to be upfront. If you're interested in a company, message them. If you use their software and you've got feedback for them, message them. You could go right to the top to the CEO. You'd be surprised. You'd be really surprised how they respond, because as I've come to realize in the last few years, we get a lot of messages on LinkedIn, but the ones that stand out are the ones from that are like actual messages. And the reason why is because most of it is spam. Most of it is actually messages trying to sell you something, or trying to, there's always an agenda. And I think a lot of the time, the ones that stand out are the ones who are like, well, I'm really interested in your journey, or I'm really interested in the company that you work for, or I'm really interested in perhaps the talk you did, or whatever it is, it might be. I do always do my best to reply to those messages, even though it's sometimes quite hard to. So that's the first thing. Don't be afraid to message. Now, whether you're in person or whether it's online, I think the most important thing is to be upfront, especially in like US and US and UK. It's very important to be very upfront with what you're after or what you have to offer. I think it just makes things a lot easier, and it just also like makes the whole process much quicker for you. So, I'm looking for an internship. I'm looking for experience or shadowing within your company. I'm looking to see if you have any jobs or opportunities. I have this to offer, which is I've got my clinical experience, or I love to code, or perhaps I've got a particularly unique set of skills or experiences that, for whatever reason, I have this to offer and I want this. Obviously, don't say it as abruptly as that, but you can make it a little bit more rosy. And I think this is also something that a lot of people forget, which is perhaps you don't want anything and you don't want to offer anything. Perhaps there is no agenda, and you can say that and be upfront with that too. You can say, listen, I've actually got no agenda at all. I just want to get to know you, or want to get to know the company. That's literally it. And that level of honesty with some people, like CEOs of companies, are incredibly busy, though. It's very refreshing for them. I'd like to think so anyway. And I've seen it myself. Years and years ago, I've messaged CEOs as well, and they've responded quickly, because I've just been very frank or very upfront with, the fact that I'm after something, or that I'm not after anything at all. And actually, most of the mentors that I have are mentors to me, because I've just said to them, listen, I would love to have you as a mentor. And just to learn about your process and the steps and the path that you took, and and hopefully learn something from that. And there's nothing wrong with being upfront about that. I think it just makes for a very healthy relationship early on with people that you're trying to speak to in the industry, and it just makes things a little bit more interesting for you. It also kind of disarms them a bit, and hopefully they open up to you a little bit more and give you a bit of insight and experience. And to be honest, I guess that's how we ended up on this podcast together. Very similar situation. And I think hats off to you guys for doing this, not just for me, but for other people in the industry, which is a really, really cool thing to do. So keep doing what you're doing. Perhaps if someone else wants to start their own podcast and do the same thing, you could do it formally through a method like this, or you can just say, let's meet for coffee, or whatever it might be. And you never know what may come of those relationships. There were bits of feedback I was giving to companies that led to a shadow experience that led to a job offer. And so those things wouldn't have happened if I wasn't messaging around and suggesting things based on software that I've used at the hospital. So that's another thing, which is always be very receptive to I guess some of the products and things that you use in your careers. It's not just about the problems in the NHS, so to speak. It could be the bits of the software or health tech stuff that you use already, the way you're like, oh, this could be done differently, or that could be done better. And rather than telling your consultant or head of procurement at the NHS, just go and message the company, and you'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true because I hear all the time, like, closed mouths don't get fed. I've had that on LinkedIn quite a bit. I've also, recently saw a video, I think it was Steve Jobs saying, kind of just, I think he sent a letter to the CEO of Hewlett Packard at the time, asking for like spare parts. And then that kind of snowballed into him actually picking up the phone. I think he went through the phone book actually, and he just it was actually a CEO who picked up, and then he was like, "Yeah, sure." He didn't like expect to speak to the CEO, but the CEO was like, "Yeah, sure, have these parts, etc." And that kind of snowballed into him getting like an internship, I think, the next year on the actually assembly line. So I thought that was a really cool video to watch, and it kind of puts into perspective how it's really important to ask, and kind of if you don't ask, you don't get. So what's the harm in kind of putting yourself out there? Um, so I think it's a really important bit of advice for our listeners. Kind of one thing I do want to touch on. I know you kind of had quite a journey, and you've had a lot of different experiences, like going over to the US, etc. If you kind of had to look back and think maybe if there was anything you would do kind of differently as maybe 18-year-old David, um, is there any particular advice that you'd kind of give him today?
That's a really good question. I'd probably say I wouldn't worry so much. But I think if I hadn't worried, I wouldn't be where I am now. So uh, actually, I mean, to be fair,
Kind
I
of putting
think
you on the spot a
I've
bit.
made I've made a lot of mistakes, and I think I without those mistakes, without also the pain that I've had in throughout my career and throughout my personal life, I don't think I'd have the empathetic insight that I have today, and I'd probably be a very, very different person. So I wouldn't go back and change anything actually. But if I was to say to anyone else that's 18 and thinking, oh wow, what's ahead of me? I think one of the biggest things now that's changed from when I was 18 was when I was 18, you look at medical school and you look at the career ahead of you and you're like, oh, it's so amazing. It looks incredible. It's also kind of socially one of like the core like STEM subjects that you've got to do. But actually now a lot of people are thinking, oh, should I be doing medicine? I'm worried about it, worried about the future of it, etc. I still think it's one of the best degrees out there to do. And I still think it opens up so many incredible doors. And what I did early on during medical school, which I'm glad I did, which was, just do everything, every hobby, music, sport, whatever it might be, like arts, drama. But I then started to really close it down towards the end of the years. And I have plenty of colleagues that I bump into occasionally, like really incredible musicians or incredible actors or like really funny people that could have been comedians. I'm like, they're just like they got their head down and they're just like powering through the tunnel that is, their career. And I think one thing that I would say to myself back then is don't ignore your hobbies, don't ignore your family, don't ignore you, and just keep, you can still juggle, you can still get through medical school, you still pass your exams, you'll still get into medical school eventually, but just don't give up aspects of what makes you you. And I think that's probably the best thing that I would say to my younger self. Go and make the same mistakes, that's absolutely fine, but most importantly, don't give up things, don't give up elements of your personality.
Well, I think all of us had to hear that because of what medical school and everything puts us through. But
Yeah.
that is really inspiring. So down to our last question now. It's looking into the future and say 10 years into the future. How do you think the industry is going to look, and how do you think the involvement of medical students is going to look after 10 years? Do you think the UK is finally going to adapt that integration of MedTech into our curricula, or where do you think it's headed?
I would love to think that it will, but realistically, it probably won't, because what are the priorities for the country right now? Well, it's to grow the workforce. We're short of almost 150 or 140,000 people. That's including every medical profession, but it's still a big number. And there's a leaking drain. There's a steady ever-growing outflow of talent. So we have to retain the talent as well as train new talent. So I think really like the people in charge of training are probably not thinking about how we can give them interesting things to learn that might take them away from the NHS. So you know, it might not be as rosy as you've kind of painted there, but I think one of the things that's for certain is the role of medical students within the industry is growing. And even at Innovus, I know we're about to start we're about to start growing the company in terms of scaling up the clinical team. But one thing that has been incredible over the last year and a half has been our associates, clinical associates. A lot of them are medical students, and they've been getting involved with so many product validation, product development, academic, evidence generation, and even commercial projects that have given them skills to then take into other jobs. And actually, some of them have gone and found roles in other companies, or have gone and boosted their CV for their own careers in whatever way that might be, whether it's medical or non-medical. And I think that's where value lies. There's this massive pool of incredibly motivated talent that want to do other things beyond medical school, that I think companies and the industry should tap into. The bigger companies like you know, the big giants out there, the Medtronics, the Hologics, etc., they don't tap into the medical students enough, in my opinion, because they want the, you know, the top surgeon or the key opinion leader or the key decision maker on board, you know. But they're sleeping on the medical students. They are truly so highly talented and motivated, and I really think that the model of the clinical associate program, it should be adopted across the industry to give almost practically every medical student an opportunity to learn something from different companies, whether it be small startups all the way to scale ups and big multinationals. So I think the future with medical students is really, really bright. The future as an industry as a whole, it's due to, I think in the next 5 years, it's due to double. I forget the growth rate off the top of my head, but it's growing so fast. And there are balloons as well in robotics and in AI. And so I also think that we may see more regulation in those elements. We may see more innovation that may reduce the size of those balloons. We'll see. I mean, it's really exciting to watch it all and to be a part of it. And I would encourage and love to see as much involvement from medical students moving forwards, because then that opens up the door to so much more innovation. It's an exciting future, I've got to say. It's going to be very, very interesting. I think also when we look at the likes of the mass data processing that we're seeing, the automated processing of that data through LLMs as well, you know, we could be looking at futures where perhaps even the entirety of medicine is practiced differently. And we could, you know, what excites me personally is that we currently live, and this is with my public health hat on now, we currently live and work in a very it's a responsive healthcare system. You know, there's a fracture, we must fix it, or there's a disease, we must cure it. It's not a wellness program. It's not a prevention program. It should be the National Wellness Service or the National Prevention Service rather than the National Health Service. And I think that's what the future, I know there are countries in the Middle East that are focusing on this as their priority in the next 10 to 20 years, where they want to shift away from this responsive model to a preventative model, where genomics are utilized to calculate exactly what you're likely to have, what medicines are best for you, and when you should start taking them in your life course, what scans and you know, screening programs you should be a part of, so that we don't even have the prevalence and associated disability adjusted life years that disease, whether it's communicable or not, will have on a population. So, you know, you can vastly impact the population's lifespan as a result of that. And that excites me. That's really exciting, because then what are these billionaires trying to do? They're all trying to live longer through all their kind of weird and wonderful ways. Well, that means it's not just for billionaires, and it becomes an equitable thing, an accessible thing for all. And then we all live longer. And that's that could be a potentially incredible thing for not only society, ourselves, but also our children and our children's children. And I think that's an amazing thing. So I look forward to seeing how the MedTech world, the health tech world grows. And I think it's definitely going to be about increasing. At the end of the day, it's all for the patients, which at the end of the day, we are patients too. So it's about human and population health. So I look forward to it. Very excited.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much. That was really insightful, and that was amazing advice there. We'd love to have you on again for another episode, maybe touching on something else. But I hope you enjoyed that as much as we did. That was actually really helpful. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you guys in the next episode. Thank
Thank you
you.
so much, guys. Thank you for having me.